Welcome to Investment Solutions by EDHEC-Risk Intitute. We're going to talk about insurance. Insurance is an extremely useful form of risk management. There are only three known forms of risk management: diversification, hedging, and insurance. Insurance comes as the last form of risk management. What we're going to talk about today is, first of all, defining what insurance is all about, why we need insurance in the first place. Then we are going to talk about dynamic hedging as a way to generate insurance-type benefits. And then we are going to look at the other side of the same coin, which is nonlinear payoffs. There's actually a one-to-one correspondence between the set of dynamic hedging strategies and the set of nonlinear payoffs. So these are two extremely useful, equivalent, but complementary views on insurance and why insurance is extremely useful. Okay, what is the key challenge? Well, the key challenge is to get upside, and lots of upside, and almost unlimited upside if possible, but without the downside. Now, I know what you think. You think it's too good to be true. If you want to go after the upside, you need to invest in risky assets, and these risky assets also have a big downside. And as a matter of fact, you're entirely right. It is precisely because they have a big downside that they enjoy the upside as well. The upside is a risk premium, is a reward that investors enjoy for taking on downside risk. So how can one enjoy upside with limited downside? Well, that's the key question, and that's what insurance is all about. Well, that cannot be delivered by diversification. Diversification is extremely useful for eliminating, also known as diversifying away, specific risks out of portfolios. But when things go really wrong, we know what's going to happen. All the correlation of the assets in your portfolio are going to jump up to 1, and you're going to be hit full force by systematic risk factors, and your portfolio is going to drop down. So diversification is not good for downside protection. Hedging, on the other hand, is extremely good for downside protection, but it kind of kills the upside at the same time as it kills the downside. So you don't get, upside with limited downside. You get, at best, limited upside in exchange for limited downside. Well, that's precisely where insurance is extremely helpful. Insurance is going to give you the best of both worlds. And again, I know what you think. I know that you think, again, that it's too good to be true. And as we will see, you're actually right. That's not a free lunch. Insurance is costly. But when insurance is implemented in the right way, well, the benefits that you can expect from insurance are actually extremely large. Okay, so what is insurance in the first place? Well, you can think about insurance as a convex payoff, or you can think about insurance as a way to do hedging, but not in a static hedging way, but in a dynamic hedging way. As we will see, these two views about insurance are two sides of the same coin. So in what follows, we are first going to introduce insurance strategies as dynamic hedging strategies, and explain what they can accomplish for us in this sense. And then we will switch to a payoff perspective, where we are going to look at insurance as a way to generate nonlinear payoff. And again, remember please that we're not going to talk about two different things. The dynamic hedging strategies replicate the convex payoff, just different ways of looking at the same thing. Okay, dynamic hedging. Well, let's think about what it means to get limited downside. Well, what it means is the following. We're talking to asset owners, institutional and individual investors. And these institutional or individual investors face something that you would call an essential goal as an individual, for example, or something that you call a floor, like a minimum value for the value of the asset in the portfolio, if you were to talk about an institutional investor. We're going to take a look at a very simple example of such a floor that's called the minimum funding ratio floor. So we're looking at a situation where the asset owner, in this case, let's say a pension fund, define a floor as a percentage K, let's say K is 90% of LT, where LT is the value of the liabilities. So what this means, it means that at all costs, we would like the asset value to be greater than 90% of liability value. Well, in a different words, what we're saying is we would like the funding ratio to be, at the very worst case, 90%. So 90% is a minimum funding ratio. Now, what you can do with a static hedging strategy, you can actually protect that minimum funding ratio with probability 1. How would you do that? Well, that's actually pretty simple. What you would do is you're going to split your asset value, your wealth, into two buckets. So, for example, let's assume that today you're currently funded at 100%. What you're going to do is you're going to take 90% of your asset value, in this case 90% because we're looking at 90% minimum funding ratio, and you're going to invest it in a safe asset, which in this case is called a liability hedging portfolio. Now, everything else, well, in this case, AT minus the floor, which in this case is 10% of your asset, will be invested in the risky performance-seeking portfolio. The one that's well diversified and therefore does a good job, or as good a job as possible, in terms of harvesting risk premia across and within asset classes. Now, we understand what's going to happen. In the worst case, what's invested in the performance-seeking portfolio will go down, and maybe eventually, in the very worst case, we'll end up with a value of 0. But that's OK, because even in the worst case, you're going to be staying with 90% of your wealth invested safe. So you're going to end up with a 90% funding ratio, which was, by assumption, your minimum. Now, we understand what's going on here. You got very limited downside. The downside is limited at 90% funding ratio, which is good. But also, you're going to get very limited upside. With this buy and hold static strategy, I invest today 90% of my wealth in safe and 10% of my wealth in risky. Well, because 10% invested in risky is extremely small, you're not going to get a large upside potential from that risky investment. Now, is there any other way to achieve the same goal, which is protect the downside, protect the minimum funding ratio with probability 1, but generate much more upside than with the previous static buy and hold strategy? Well, the answer is yes. But to do so, you have to be willing to accept implementation of a dynamic portfolio strategy as opposed to a static portfolio strategy. So let's just take a look at a very simple dynamic strategy that will give you downside protection with much more upside. What we're going to do is we're going to invest in the risky asset some function, let's call it F, some function of the value of the asset and the value of the floor. And everything else will be invested in safe. Now, in terms of the choice of that function, what we want that function to do for us, we want that function to be equal to 0 if AT gets equal to FT. In other words, if asset value goes down, 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 all the way to the floor, well, then we want to get rid of risk taking so as to stay at the floor level and not take a chance of going below the floor level. An example, a very popular example of such strategies is the so-called CPPI, standing for constant proportion portfolio insurance strategy. In this case, the function f, so we're looking for a function f of two variables, x and y, that takes on value 0 when x is equal to y. Well, the very simplest example of such a function is m, a constant multiplier, times the distance minus between x and y. So in other words, we take the number of dollars invested in the risky asset a multiple of the distance to the floor. Now, clearly, the only difference between this strategy and the static strategy that we saw before is that the static strategy that we saw before is a specific example of these strategies with a multiplier m equals 1. So if you take m equal 1 in this case, what you get is the static strategy that we talked about before. Now, if you take m greater than 1, m equal 2, 3, or 4, or 5, well then, you get something that will give you downside protection with much more upside. Now, there are lots of subtleties and technicalities in how to implement strategies like this, and much more subtle and much more beneficial strategies in the context of dynamic hedging. And you will get lots and lots of information about those strategies on our website, looking at how to use insurance in the context of investment solutions. Now, I said before that looking at dynamic strategies is equivalent to looking at nonlinear payoff. So let me explain what I meant by that. If you look only at static strategies, then you get linear payoffs. So on this graph, what you can see is the flat line here is what you get if you invest in safe. On the x-axis, you get different values for the risky asset. And on the y-axis, you get different value for some portfolio. Well, if the portfolio, which is the blue line, is the risky asset itself, then you get a straight line with a 45-degree angle, like a slope equal to 1. So when the risky asset is equal to 200, then the payoff of that portfolio, which is invested in the risky asset, is 200. Now, if you look at the safe asset, what happens? By definition of the safe asset being safe, it's going to have a payoff that's going to be the same for all possible states of the world. So regardless of whether the underlying risky asset does well or does poorly, you're going to get like a flat, payoff. Now, of course, that's a 0 slope, and that's slope equal to 1. Now, if you go 50% invested in risky and 50% invested in safe, you get a slope which is halfway between 0 and 1, which is, 0.5. That's exactly what you get here. OK, these are linear payoffs. With safe, you get no upside, and you get no downside. With the risky portfolio, you get lots of upside, but also lots of downside. With half-half, you get some upside, not too much, some downside, not too much. Can we do better than this? Well, first of all, maybe we can think about introducing leverage. Well, if you introduce leverage, like this guy here is 50% leverage, what we do is we borrow. We have $100, we borrow $50 more by shorting the safe asset, and we invest $150 in the risky asset. Well, what you get then, you get a slope of the payoff that is steeper, that has a higher value. Well, the value in this case is 1.5. Now, why are you happy that you get a 1.5 type of slope? Well, the reason is, remember that when you invest 100% in risky, if you want to get a payoff of 200 for your portfolio, you have to wait until the risky asset goes to 200. Now, with leverage, it only takes an increase of the risky asset value to 175 for you to get to 100 with the level portfolio strategy. That's the beauty of leverage. But of course, on the downside, leverage not only magnifies upside potential, leverage also magnifies downside risk. So when the risky assets loses value, you're losing more value with leverage. Well, leverage can be useful, but it's still a linear payoff. It's not a convex payoff. Well, with dynamic hedging strategies and also with derivatives like options, you can get nonlinear payoff. Now, this is the beauty of a nonlinear convex payoff. If you look at what happens here, you've got limited downside. At some point, whatever does the risky asset, even if the risky asset does very poorly and goes down a lot, the value of your portfolio stays constant. So you get a limited downside. You get limited downside, but you also get pretty good upside exposure. Now, as we said, insurance is not a free lunch. Insurance comes at a cost. And the cost can be seen from the fact that the insurance strategy has a lower slope compared to the 100% invested in the risky asset strategy. And the fact the slope is lower, the flattening of that straight line, is an indication of the opportunity cost of insurance. Now, if you want to reduce the opportunity cost of insurance using dynamic portfolio strategies and/or options, you can also do it. And the way to do it is, what you're going to do is you're not only going to give up on the downside and reduce downside risk, you're also going to engineer your dynamic hedging strategy in such a way that you're going to give up on the upside above and beyond a certain threshold, which is some kind of target for you. So in other words, your client doesn't have a goal that exceeds that target. Now, as you can see, by doing so, then you get the constant flat payoff beyond the target. So even if the risky asset does really well, you don't enjoy all of that upside. But the beauty of giving up on some of the upside is that it's going to pay for the cost of downside protection. It's going to compensate for the cost of downside protection. Well, in this case, it actually more than compensates for the cost of downside protection. Because if you look at the slope of that line, when the risky asset does okay, well, the slope of that line is actually slightly greater than 1. So that suggests that giving up on the upside allows you to make up, or more than make up, for the cost of downside protection. Well, this is an invitation for you to take a close look at all the material that we have on our website, the EDHEC-Risk Investment Solution, dedicated to the use of insurance strategies using dynamic strategies and/or options for constructing extremely useful, welfare-improving forms of investment solutions that will allow investors to meet their target aspirational goal with a high probability, while at the same time securing their essential goals with almost 100% probability. Thank you for your attention.